Good afternoon. Thank you, Dale, for that nice introduction. I've got to update my website. I haven't been the chair of the Department of Education for 7 years. So I'm always reminding myself, like, you got to update your, I'm so low tech. And then when I hear this lovely, everything else about what you said is probably fairly accurate, but thank goodness I'm no longer the chair of my department. So we just go forward here. Just press these buttons here. This is okay. I need a little help here. So I'm going to be talking about peer victimization and racial contexts of schools this afternoon in my short time here. I could go on and on about this topic, so Mark's going to keep me on task. But before I start, I want to make 2 observations because I think they'll be relevant in the comments that I'm going to make. The first observation is that a lot of the research on peer victimization that goes on and is published in child development and educational psychology and school psychology journals, a lot of it is carried out in urban schools with multiple racial ethnic groups represented. But unfortunately, this isn't true for all research, but largely, a lot of that research really doesn't pay much attention to the racial ethnic context. And I think that's disappointing because both the risk factors that lead to greater victimization and the protective factors that buffer against the experience of victimization, those are going to be influenced by such important context factors like the racial and ethnic diversity of schools and neighborhoods, as well as the social and ethnic identities that are most salient to youth. So it's unfortunate that not enough of the research, as important as that work has been, has paid attention to the racial ethnic context. The second observation I want to make is about the changing racial ethnic demography of the United States. Does this go okay? It's okay. Now I gotta multitask here. You've probably seen many versions of this kind of graphical representation from census data of the changing racial ethnic landscape. The sort of chartreuse bars are the white population. The bluish are Black, African American, Latino, Asian, and other. And this is from 1920 and projected out to 2060, 100 years. So what you see here is 2 main things. First of all, that we're no longer a biracial society with a large white majority and small African American Black minority. We are now becoming a country of racial minorities. The white population is steadily decreasing and largely driven by the forces of immigration. The Latino and Asian populations are growing. In fact, Asian populations, although small, is the fastest growing racial ethnic group in the United States. And projected out here by 2040 and then 2060, that dotted line is that critical 50% white. Whites are no longer going to be the numerical majority group in this country, and we will truly be a nation of racial ethnic minorities. And because of the forces of immigration and an immigration that's primarily non-white and differential birth rates in different racial ethnic groups, you see this even more strongly in the under 18 population. So this table here shows the changing demographics of the K-12 population in public schools in the U.S. from 1968 to 2014. The 2014 demographics in the U.S. public schools is like the projected between 2040 and 2060 population of the larger society. That you can see that whites have dropped from being 80% of the kids in public schools throughout the country down to just over half. African Americans, our population has stayed about the same in the country really for the past 100 years. Latinos are increasing and Asian, and the census data doesn't well break down Asian and other quite yet. And so within a very short time, whites are not going to be the majority group in the public schools of the U.S. And public schools are going to be the first major social institution without a clear racial ethnic majority. The problem is, or the complexity is, that the population is growing, increasing. The K-12 population is increasingly racially and ethnically diverse, but the schools are more segregated now than they have been in the last 40 years, really since the landmark achievements following Brown versus Board of Education. If you look nationally, white kids attend schools where about 80% of the kids are white. African American and Latinos attend schools where 2/3 to 3/4 of the kids are of their racial ethnic group. My colleague at UCLA, Gary Orfield, calls schools that are 99% one racial ethnic group, Black or Latino, as apartheid schools. So in general, racially diverse schools have more resources, and kids are doing better. On average, we don't want to say this universally, when schools are diverse. Certainly we know that the achievement gap is reduced as the diversity of the schools increases. So I could give a long talk about, the issues surrounding racial and ethnic diversity, but for the purposes of this talk, I just want to say that social developmental psychologists like myself and educational psychologists and special ed folk and school administrators, we need to be sitting around the table talking about the benefits of racial and ethnic diversity. So in my talk today, I want to do 3 things related to my observations. First, I want to describe how the ethnic context shapes the experience of victimization in schools. I tend to focus on adolescents and middle schools. I want to use an attributional analysis as a theoretical scaffold. I'll tell you a little bit more about this in a second. When we're dealing, this is my bias as a developmental social psychologist, when we're dealing with these kind of complex phenomena, we need a theory to guide us, to help us manage some of that complexity. I'm what's called an attribution theorist, so when I talk about victimization in the context, I'm going to be talking about attributions that kids make about their experiences with victimization. And the third point I want to make is to help make an argument for the psychological benefits of racial ethnic diversity in urban schools. That's what I want to do, okay? I'll probably be talking really fast now. So definitional issues, peer victimization for us. Well, there's 2 things that describe peer victimization. It's abuse, it's psychological, physical, or verbal abuse of victims by perpetrators who intend to cause them harm. And the critical thing that distinguishes victimization from conflict between peers that happens all the time is an imbalance of power, the stronger picking on the weaker, the older picking on the younger, the intellectually superior picking on the intellectually challenged, whatever is an imbalance of power and the intent to cause harm. Those are the critical things that distinguish victimization from conflict. So things like hitting, pushing, racial slurs, intimidating gestures, spreading of rumors, social exclusion, in person and increasingly in cyberspace. These are the kinds of behaviors that we study when we talk about peer victimization. So I don't talk about more lethal kinds of peer hostilities like school shootings, as important understanding as those are. Fortunately, school shootings are rare events. They remain rare events. So the kind of peer victimization I talk about is the everyday experiences of physical, verbal, and psychological abuse that kids experience, and that have been designated a public health concern by the American Medical Association. Peer victimization is really prevalent, and it's associated with a host of negative outcomes. I tend to focus on psychological outcomes. Kids who are chronic victims often are rejected by their peers. They feel depressed, lonely, and anxious, and that impacts their school performance. I really like this quote. Gosh, losing my place with this keyboard here. I really like this quote from Arne Duncan at the first White House conference on school bullying, where he said, "A school where children don't feel safe is a school where children struggle to learn. It's a school where children drop out, tune out, and get depressed. Bullying is very much an educational priority that goes to the heart of school performance and school culture." We need to be thinking about bullying and its effect on the social lives and the emotional lives of children and their academic lives. So my theoretical perspective, so I indicated that if you want to understand these complicated problems, you need a theory to guide you. And you may like or not like my theory, but I'm going to be talking about victimization from an attributional perspective. So I'm particularly interested in the relationship between peer victimization and these adjustment outcomes like depression and anxiety and low self-esteem and peer rejection. And I try to study the mediators or the processes that might explain it. And attributions are one such process. Attributions are answers to why questions, like why did I fail the test, or why doesn't anybody like me? We're more likely to make attributions in negative rather than positive situations. That's why they're relevant to the experience of peer victimization. So think about a kid, think about chronic experiences with victimization, or even one particularly painful event. A student is likely to ask, why? Why did this happen? And in the absence of any kind of disconfirming evidence, and this is the troublesome part, some kids might be likely to blame themselves for the experience of victimization. There's something about me, I'm a lousy kid, doesn't happen to anybody else, I deserve this. And relevant to this analysis is a distinction that was made by Ronnie Janoff-Bullman a long time ago with adults in the study of rape, which is another obvious form of victimization. And she made an important distinction, which we've adopted in our work, between behavioral and characterological self-blame. Behavioral self-blame is what she calls control-related, attributions to something modifiable, your behavior, and it's associated with a belief in the future avoidability. Things don't have to be this way. Characterological self-blame is esteem-related, involves attributions to something non-modifiable, and is associated with a belief in personal deservingness. From an attribution perspective, if you know about the achievement area, or ability and effort, why is it that we know it's better to attribute your failures to lack of effort rather than lack of ability? Like behavioral self-blame, effort is controllable. I can try hard if I want to. It's unstable. Things don't have to be all that way, and it's modifiable. There are things that I can, in my repertoire, that I can do to change it. Unlike low ability, low aptitude, maybe you like the distinction that Carol Dweck makes between entity and incremental theories of intelligence. It's very much guided by attributional analysis. When it's low ability or characterological self-blame, it's me, there's nothing I can do about it, and things are always going to be that way. And indeed, in research in the adults on dealing with depression, individuals who endorse more characterological self-blaming attributions for their adjustment difficulties feel worse and are more depressed and cope more poorly than individuals who adopt behavioral self-blaming attributions. So we adopted that distinction and proposed two hypothetical sequences involving peer victimization. Victimization, where you attribute it to self-blame, characterological self-blame, it's me, it's going to be that way all the time. It's going to be more related to maladaptive responses. In contrast, victimization, where you make behavioral self-blaming attributions, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, they're controllable and unstable, that should be related to less maladaptive responses. Now, this may seem intuitively reasonable. Like, well, of course, attribution theory is based on a naive analysis of human behavior, but before Jana Jubin and I, my colleague, did this work, even though researchers had begun to document the negative relationship between victimization and adjustment difficulties, there was very little work on mediating psychological mechanisms. So we were the first to show, in fact, that it makes a difference. I'm going to go a little bit more quickly here. We have good measures of characterological and behavioral self-blame. We actually use a hypothetical vignette method. You know, it's hard to be in the heat of the moment and catch kids' experiences of victimization and then ask them why they occurred. So as a theoretical attribution theorist, I think it's okay to use vignettes because what people say they would think or feel or do if certain situations are present maps on reasonably well to what they would actually do in those situations. So we have vignettes that are typical experiences. Imagine this happened to you. Then we have questions that tap into characterological self-blame. As you can see here, it's very reliable. This sort of thing is more likely to happen to me than to other kids. Would you think this? And they respond. Questions about behavioral self-blame. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I should have been more careful. Are you getting the difference between these two major types of attributions? And And indeed, we find that in our very first study that these are kids, the green bars are kids who are actually victims by self-report and peer reputation. The yellow bars are the 40% of the kids who were not victims at all. They didn't think they were victims, their peers didn't think they were. And you see very clearly that the kids who are victimized are more likely to endorse characterological self-blaming attributions, whereas there were no differences in the two groups in the behavioral self-blame. Back then, we did everything. This is an article published in 1998, and where the old-fashioned way of testing mediation, the relationship between victimization and adjustment was somewhat diminished when you put characterological self-blame in the model. It mediates the relationship. These are robust relationships. We have other indicators. This is just one of our studies where you go from victimization, characterological self-blame, to maladjustment, the psychological maladjustment, to school achievement. So some of the effect of being a victim on poor school achievement is mediated or explained by characterological self-blame and poor psychological adjustment. We have a longitudinal study showing the relationships between victimization, self-blame, and social anxiety over time in high school. Fortunately, all these things go down from 9th grade to 12th grade. There's less perceived victimization, there's less self-blame, there's less social anxiety, but there is variation, especially at the intercept at the beginning. And the slopes, the relationship between these variables, the slope between victimization and social anxiety is in part mediated by changes in characterological self-blame. So we think these are pretty strong relationships, that the kinds of attributions that you make for your experiences with victimization have implications for your immediate adjustment over time, and in fact these relationships are predictive of depression and workplace harassment and romantic relationship harassment 1 or 2 years after high school. So now let me put this in the context I started out talking about the ethnic context. So here's my model. How does the ethnic context shape this? This is what I want to talk about. I want to say something about how the ethnic context affects peer victimization and psychological adjustment. I want to say something about how the ethnic context affects this relationship between victimization and adjustment. And finally, most importantly, I want to say something about how the ethnic context affects this relationship between peer victimization and attributions. There's 2 big longitudinal samples that this work derives from. I'm not going to be linking one. I'm going to talk about 3 studies. This was our first study, in LAUSD to recruit a diverse sample where 75% of the population is Latino. You got to be really strategic, and we were fortunate to be able to do that. And the schools vary in terms of the ethnic representation. In our current longitudinal study, we got more ambitious, 26 schools, and all the racial ethnic groups are represented in schools where they're the sometimes majority, sometimes 2 groups, and sometimes in very diverse samples. So when I make arguments about the relationship between victimization and school diversity, I can say that it applies to all racial ethnic groups. One take-home message of this talk is, if you're studying victimization and ethnicity, it's not about any one racial ethnic group. It really is about the context and the racial ethnic diversity of the context that you're in. And this is our large sample that's also very racially and ethnically diverse. You have to have good measures of diversity. So this is our measure of ethnic diversity at the school or the classroom level. It's probably similar to the way school districts keep track of the racial ethnic diversity of the population. You look at all the percentage representation of all the groups. The higher the number, the more diverse the school, the greater probability that 2 kids randomly selected will be from a different racial ethnic group. So more groups, more equally balanced, that's greater racial ethnic diversity. You with me? Okay. So first, I'm going to make a 3-part argument. First argument that I'm going to make is that in more diverse schools, students feel less vulnerable because there's a greater balance of power between different ethnic groups. Remember back in the beginning, that imbalance of power, that's a critical predictor of peer victimization. My argument that an imbalance of power isn't just older kids picking on bigger kids, it's numerical majorities and numerical minorities. So when you have a diverse school with all groups relatively equally represented in an ideal world, you should have less victimization, less feeling of vulnerability, according to these basic principles of peer victimization research. And indeed, That's what we found. We had really good measures of victimization, loneliness, self-worth, and school safety. If you want to talk to me afterwards about our measurement, I'd be happy to. For those of you who are not in the academic world, we do something in all of our analyses called hierarchical linear modeling, because you always want to be looking at, does the context, the racial ethnic diversity of the classroom or the school, does that have some independent effects on the outcome? So it's even more than just individual characteristics. It's not about whether you're black, white, African American, or Latino. It's the context in which you're going to school. And so this kind of using this method allows us to do that. That's all I'm going to say about the statistics. And for testing this hypothesis about greater ethnic diversity leads to less feelings of vulnerability, and indeed it does. On the x-axis is the increasing school diversity by the Simpson's index. On the y-axis are these different indicators of vulnerability, and you can see that perceived school safety, the green. These aren't dramatic findings, but they're all statistically significant and we think substantively meaningful also. You feel safer as diversity increases. You feel less lonely. You feel less victimized. The only variable that doesn't vary so much is self-worth. We could have a conversation about studying self-worth, self-esteem in racially ethnically diverse populations. So you don't see a lot of change in self-worth, but you do see a lot of change in these other groups. Greater balance of power, more diversity helps kids feel less vulnerable. School diversity is good. Now this is the one where my whole rest of my talk is going to be that one slide repeating. I don't know why it kept repeating. Okay, second context, so non-diverse schools. And I purposefully use figures here because it's not about one ethnic group, it's about the context. Imagine you had a school with all these green kids, this is a non-diverse context, and some purple kids or pink kids. So which group do you think would feel more victimized? Well, you'd probably say the minority, thinking about an imbalance of power, they're probably going to get picked on more, which is probably true. But suppose I switch the question up and I ask you, if you're a victim and you're a majority or minority group, you're in this non-diverse context, in which situation would you feel worse about it? Would you have more of these negative psychological outcomes? And we argue that it's worse if you're a victim and you're a green kid, you're a member of the racial ethnic majority group. It's like, how could you help but think it must be something about me? You deviate from the norm for your group to be powerful, to be numerically powerful. We know in adolescence, deviation from the norm has really important psychological and social outcomes. So in this second study, we said it's a non-diverse context. There's some challenges in non-diverse contexts, particularly if I'm a victim and I'm a member of the majority group, I'm going to be more vulnerable. And indeed, we found that to be true. So the second part of my argument is that in these non-diverse schools, if you're a victim and a majority group member, you feel especially vulnerable. You deviate from the norm for your group. So illustrating with social anxiety, on the x-axis is experiences with victimization. On the y-axis is social anxiety. And this is at the classroom level. The yellow bar is kids who are high in percent same ethnicity. What are you saying? 5 minutes. Oh, okay, I got to move. The relationships were stronger when you were in the majority than when you were in the minority. So support for this idea of deviating from the norm, being a victim and a member of the majority group. How does this relate to attribution? So that came up twice. So how does this relate to attributions? Here's my argument. Deviating from the norm, being a victim and part of the majority group, promotes self-blaming attribution. So let's get back to my fundamental interest in how kids interpret experiences with victimization. So let's just illustrate. In a non-diverse context, I'm a member of and I'm always talking about this relationship between victimization, self-blame, and adjustment. I'm a majority group. I'm a victim. I have no choice but to blame myself. There are not a lot of other attributions in my repertoire to help me cope with it. If I'm the powerful group and I'm still getting picked on, it must be something about me. In contrast, if you are, if you are in a minority group, you have possibilities to attribute your outcomes, say, for example, to the prejudice of other people. We know that external attributions, like attributions to prejudice, they're not good. We don't want people feeling a lot of discrimination, but typically they don't implicate the self, it's somebody else. And finally, in more diverse contexts, remember my underlying argument, diversity is good, you might have multiple attributions. It might be me, it might be them. So this relationship between victimization and self-blame should be uncertain. And when we did this study, indeed, we found that to be true. So the strongest relationship between victimization and self-blame occurred when you were the majority, the weakest relationship when you were a minority, and being in a diverse context was somewhere in between. This is the first study that, or one of few studies, I'm not going to say the first of anything, that looks at a developmental process and how an ethnic context variable moderates that process. We need to be doing more of that in developmental research. So let me just make this attributional argument a little bit stronger, and I'm going to be there, Mark. I'm going to be in my 4 more minutes. Just not focus on characterological self-blame. Let's think about a larger attributional pattern. I'm implied that there's multiple attributions that people can make. So we've elaborated on our attributional questionnaire to really tap more strongly into not only behavioral and characterological self-blame, but external attributions, unstable attributions like bad luck, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, this was just one of those days, stuff happens. That's an unstable attribution. So we had a much more extended questionnaire. We did factor analysis, and indeed we had these factors emerge. And so we then did person-centered analyses. You know, I think the field does too much person-centered analyses, but sometimes it's relevant because I'm really interested not just in whether you're making characterological or behavioral self-blaming attributions, but what might be your pattern of attributional endorsement. So you could think, well, these are the kids who are going to be really most in trouble in terms of their attributions. Big on characterological and smaller on unstable or external. Then there might be the big unstable group. You know, that's adaptive. It doesn't have to be this way all the time. And then there could be this group who's more into external or lower attribution. So we actually did our person-centered analysis, found these different types of attribution profiles, and they look something like this. So the top line, the blue one, the top one. This is the group we most worry about. It's me and it's them too. Attributions that are going to be stable over time. Partly me, partly the other people. The most adaptive attributions are the ones at the bottom. It's not me. This is what we want to see. Don't blame yourself. It's not me. Maybe it's them. It's bad luck. It's not me. It's probably them. So patterns of attribution emerge from our analysis. Then the question is, what's the consequences of these patterns and what are the predictors of these patterns? And quickly to the consequences, it's just what you would expect. So if you look at depression, anxiety, and safety as 3 critical psychological consequences of victimization, you can see that when you're in the green group and the red group, the not me group, you're doing a lot better across all of these outcomes. So this is MANOVA, and all of these differences are significant. So these profiles have some relationship to outcomes. What predicts membership in these profile groups? So here I'm comparing the most maladaptive group, it's me and them, to the other 3. What's the odds of being in the most maladaptive group compared to the other 3 groups? And I don't want you to try to worry about these hierarchical models, and I'm just showing you what I'm going to say in terms of the predictors. What predicts membership in this most maladaptive attribution group? It's being a victim. Well, of course. It's being a member of the majority group. And here's the interesting part. It's being African American compared to these other racial ethnic groups. So this is one time where the particular racial ethnic group is important. And why is this important? Because this is really an example of deviation from the norm. If you look at these same data and you look at these kids' reputations, who are the aggressive kids? Who are the cool kids? It's quite dramatic here. The African American kids are perceived as more aggressive. They're perceived as cooler. You know, in middle school, the cool kids are the ones that you sort of admire and look up to in a certain way. And so if you're a victim, and you're in that majority group and you're African American, you're really deviating from the norm for your group. So this reputational variable supports that. And the final analysis, which gets me back to my diversity argument, we did find an effect of school diversity, and it looks something like this. The odds of being in these more adaptive groups compared to the most maladaptive, that increases as school ethnic diversity increases. You're less likely to be in this most maladaptive profile as the school racial ethnic diversity increases. So My argument is that ethnic diversity fosters more attributional ambiguity, attributions that don't implicate the self. That's what we're looking for, a greater repertoire of perceived causes of victimization that can ward off self-blaming tendencies. So I hope these 3 quick studies showed that ethnic diversity promotes more of a shared balance of power, less vulnerability, multiple norms, you're not person and fit, you're not deviating from the norm, and greater attributional ambiguity. Implications for intervention? Well, I think we need to be supporting legal options to promote school racial ethnic diversity. I say legal options because we have to be working within the confines of what our recent Supreme Court decisions have told us we can do. There's still ways to promote racial ethnic diversity. I think we need to be focusing on how diversity matters rather than if it does. The if question for me is done with. It's how diversity matters. I think it matters in these ways when I look at psychological factors related to victimization, and I think we need targeted intervention with victimized youth to change maladaptive attributions. At lunch, we talked a little bit about school-wide interventions like the OVAES program. No question those are important to do. It's a little hard to transport them into the US context, but we also need targeted interventions that focus on changing maladaptive attributions of victimized kids. I better stop. Okay, thank you. My acknowledgement.